The street was alive in the careless way cities often were at dusk, loud with engines, voices, impatience, and the illusion that nothing truly mattered. Neon signs blinked awake above storefronts. Pedestrians moved in loose clusters, wrapped in their own concerns, scrolling phones, chasing buses, thinking about dinner. Nobody was paying attention to the man standing near the curb, holding a paper bag in one hand and a phone in the other. He looked ordinary. Too ordinary to matter. His name was Daniel Cross. To the world, Daniel was a single father in his early 40s, wearing a plain dark jacket, faded jeans, and shoes polished just enough to suggest habit, not wealth. His hair was neatly trimmed, his posture relaxed but alert, the posture of someone who had learned patience the hard way. He had just finished picking up food for his daughter, who was waiting at home with homework spread across the dining table. This moment, this street, was just another pause in an uneventful evening. Until the shouting began. It wasn't loud at first. Just sharp laughter cutting through the noise, followed by raised voices. Daniel glanced up instinctively, not with alarm but awareness. Years of responsibility had taught him to notice shifts in tone the way sailors read wind. Across the street, 3 young men had circled a woman near a closed boutique. They were well-dressed, expensive sneakers, designer jackets, confidence spilling from them like perfume. Their laughter was aggressive, their words careless and invasive. The woman tried to move away. One of the men stepped into her path. People noticed but not enough to act. Some slowed their steps. Others pretended not to see. A few glanced, judged the risk and kept walking. This was how cities protected themselves, by minding their own business. Daniel watched quietly. He didn't rush forward. He didn't clench his fists or raise his voice. He studied the scene the way he studied boardrooms, negotiations, crises. The men weren't drunk. They were entitled. That was worse. Entitlement made people reckless. Made them blind. The woman's voice shook as she told them to leave her alone. One of the men leaned closer, smiling, enjoying the fear he had created. Another laughed louder, checking to see who was watching. The third scanned the street, his eyes briefly passing over Daniel without stopping. Daniel felt the familiar sensation of being invisible. He had cultivated it for decades. He took a slow breath. Daniel remembered another street many years ago when he had been truly powerless. Back then he had learned the cost of silence. He had learned how quickly cruelty flourished when decent people chose comfort over action. That lesson had shaped everything he became. It was why he had built his life the way he had, quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. The men stepped closer to the woman. One reached out, fingers brushing her arm. That was enough. Daniel crossed the street. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked with calm, deliberate steps, stopping just close enough to be heard. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and unhurried. "Gentlemen," he said. "That's enough." The men turned, surprised more than threatened. They took in his appearance and dismissed him instantly. No suit. No entourage. No visible authority. One of them smirked. "And who are you supposed to be?" the tallest asked. Daniel met his gaze without hostility. "Someone asking you to step away." The woman moved behind Daniel instinctively, relief flashing across her face. The men laughed. "Mind your business, old man," another said. "This doesn't concern you." Daniel nodded slightly as if considering the statement. "It does now." That was when their tone shifted from mocking to aggressive. They stepped closer, surrounding him the way predators tested boundaries. One puffed out his chest. Another cracked his knuckles. They expected fear. They expected retreat. Daniel felt neither. He had stood across from men who controlled nations, corporations, and fortunes larger than these boys could imagine. He had negotiated during financial collapses and legal storms. He had learned that power was not volume. It was leverage. And leverage came from preparation. "You've got 5 seconds, the tallest said, to walk away." Daniel glanced at his watch. "Actually," he replied, "you do." The laughter stopped. One of the men shoved him lightly, testing. Daniel didn't move. The push had no weight behind it. It was theater. Daniel's phone vibrated in his hand. He looked down briefly, then back up. "That was your last mistake," he said quietly. The men scoffed, unaware that several blocks away, systems had already begun to turn. Calls were routing. Cameras were pulling footage. Names were being checked against databases that never forgot. Daniel had not raised his voice. He had not revealed himself. He had simply stopped pretending to be powerless. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance. The woman gripped Daniel's sleeve, whispering, "Please, are you sure?" Daniel smiled, not at the men but at her. "I'm sure." As the street slowly began to notice what was happening, the balance shifted. The young men glanced around, sensing something was wrong but unable to name it. Confidence cracked. Laughter vanished. And for the first time that evening they felt watched. Daniel Cross stood calmly between them and the woman, an invisible titan in plain clothes, waiting for consequences to arrive. And they always arrived. The sirens grew louder, threading through traffic like a warning the city could no longer ignore. One of the young men turned his head, trying to look casual, but his shoulders tightened. Another stared at Daniel's hands, searching for a weapon, a badge, anything that explained the calm. Daniel gave them nothing but stillness. "Back off," the tallest said, pointing at Daniel's chest as if the gesture could restore control. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Daniel didn't answer. Heroes chased applause. Daniel chased outcomes. Behind him, the woman's breathing came fast and uneven. Daniel shifted half a step, placing more of his body between her and their reach. It was small, almost gentle, but it drew a line the men understood. A few pedestrians stopped. Someone lifted a phone to record. The young men noticed the attention and tried to laugh it off, but laughter didn't land the same when witnesses were watching. "Everybody wants a video," the shortest muttered. "Let's just go." The tallest shot him a look. Pride argued with caution. Pride usually won. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, old man. You don't know who you're messing with." Daniel's eyes stayed level. "You don't either." That answer unsettled them more than an insult. The tallest reached out, grabbed Daniel's jacket and yanked. Daniel caught his wrist. Not with rage. With precision. The young man froze. Daniel's grip was firm enough to stop movement, controlled enough to avoid harm, and confident enough to suggest experience. The city noise continued, but inside that small circle of space, everything narrowed. "Let go," the man hissed. Daniel leaned in just enough for him to hear. "Walk away." The man tried to pull free. He couldn't. His friends stared, confused and suddenly nervous. Their world had rules. Older men flinched, strangers backed down, women stayed quiet. This moment broke those rules. A dark SUV turned the corner, private security, not police, moving with purpose. It pulled to the curb as if it had been summoned by a silent signal. Two men stepped out in fitted coats, earpieces visible, eyes scanning the scene. They approached at a controlled pace, one angling left, the other right, forming a quiet perimeter. The tallest harasser's face drained. "Who the hell are they?" Daniel released his wrist. "Consequences," he said. The first security man spoke into his collar mic. "We have eyes on the subjects." "Confirmed." The tallest tried to recover. "This is nothing," he snapped. "You can't." "Sir," the second security man cut in, polite but cold, "step back. Hands where we can see them." The shortest whispered, "Bro, let's go. Now." But pride still fought. The tallest pointed at Daniel. "He touched me first." Daniel spoke to the security men, tone soft. "No injuries. Keep it clean." "Yes, Mr. Cross," the first man replied automatically. The street went quiet in a different way. The woman's eyes widened. The name landed like a weight. "Mr. Cross." Not sir. Not boss. A name said with a respect that didn't need explanation. A couple of bystanders leaned in, phones steady. The harassers exchanged looks. They had heard the name before, not from the news but from whispers, fundraisers, investor dinners, family connections that opened doors. Cross Capital. Cross Foundation. Cross Holdings. An empire built without spectacle. "Daniel Cross?" the tallest said as if speaking it aloud might be a mistake. Daniel didn't confirm. He didn't deny. He held the young man's gaze until the truth assembled itself like a verdict. Then the police arrived, two squad cars sliding to a stop at the edge of the crowd. Officers stepped out quickly, eyes taking in the scene. Three young men tense and cornered, a frightened woman, and a calm man standing like the center of gravity. One officer approached Daniel first. "Mr. Cross," he said carefully. "Are you okay?" The tallest harasser's mouth opened, then closed. Daniel nodded once. I'm fine. She's the one who needs help. The officer turned toward the woman, voice softening. Ma'am, are you hurt? She shook her head, tears finally spilling now that she was no longer forcing strength. They wouldn't leave me alone, she whispered. The officer's jaw tightened. He gestured to his partner. Get statements. Run their IDs. The harassers protested, suddenly eager to explain, to bargain, to rewrite the last 5 minutes. But the officers were already separating them, already asking questions, already noting witnesses and nearby cameras. The tallest tried one last angle. He leaned toward Daniel. Look, Mr. Cross, we didn't know. We can fix this. Daniel's expression didn't change. You can't fix character, he said. But you can face consequences. He turned to the woman. Do you have someone to call? She nodded, wiping her cheeks. My sister. She's nearby. Good, Daniel said. Call her. Stay with the officer. As she dialed, she looked up at him, disbelief still on her face. Why did you help me? She asked, voice small. Daniel's eyes flicked to the darkening sky, then back. Because someone should have helped sooner, he said. And because my daughter is watching the world I leave her. His phone buzzed again. A single message from his chief of staff. Security confirmed. Media contained. Daniel slid the phone away without replying. He didn't want headlines. He wanted the woman safe and the lesson delivered. Across the street, a man in a suit stared, recognizing him from a shareholder meeting years ago, then quickly looked down as if witnessing a secret and kept walking silently. The officers guided the young men toward the squad cars. Their designer confidence had evaporated, replaced by the pale fear of records, courtrooms, and consequences that couldn't be laughed away. Daniel picked up his paper bag, checked his phone, and stepped back from the scene as if he had merely finished an errand. But the city had seen him now. And the men who thought the street belonged to them would never forget the weight of silence. The crowd dispersed slowly as if reluctant to release the moment. Phones lowered. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. The street reclaimed its noise, but something intangible lingered, like a bruise you felt hours after the impact. Daniel Cross walked away without looking back, the paper bag swinging lightly at his side, his pace unchanged. To anyone watching, he was just another man heading home after a long day. To those who knew better, he was a reminder that power did not always arrive with warning. 2 blocks later, Daniel paused at a crosswalk, the red light bathing his face in a faint glow. His reflection stared back at him from a darkened storefront window. He looked tired. Not physically, mentally. Intervening had been necessary, but it had also been costly in a way money could never repair. Every time he stepped out of the shadows, even briefly, the world leaned closer, curious, hungry. His phone buzzed again. Security wants confirmation you're clear, said the calm voice of his head of operations when he answered. I'm clear, Daniel replied. Send the report to legal. I want charges pursued. No settlements. There was a brief pause. Understood. Daniel ended the call and crossed the street as the light changed. He thought of his daughter, Emma, waiting at home. She would ask why dinner was late. He would smile, apologize, and listen to her recount her day with the seriousness of someone describing a global summit. Those moments grounded him. They reminded him why he had chosen this life of restraint instead of indulgence. Across town, in a glass-walled penthouse overlooking the river, the ripple had already reached its second shore. Elliot Crane stood at his window, tie loosened, phone pressed to his ear. He was one of the city's quiet power brokers, a man whose wealth lived behind trusts and shell companies, whose name appeared on donor lists but never in headlines. He listened as his assistant relayed what had happened on the street. Are you certain it was Cross? Elliot asked. Yes, sir. Multiple confirmations. Security footage. Witnesses. Elliot exhaled slowly. He hates attention. That's why this matters, the assistant said. The boys involved. One of them is Mark Reynolds' nephew. Elliot's jaw tightened. Mark Reynolds was old money. Arrogant money. The kind that believed consequences were negotiable. Mark won't like this, Elliot said. Cross won't care. Elliot ended the call and poured himself a drink he wouldn't finish. Daniel Cross stepping in publicly was not just a moral act, it was a signal. And signals shifted markets, alliances, and expectations. Back at the police precinct, the 3 young men sat in separate rooms, their confidence fully dissolved. Statements contradicted each other. Video footage filled the gaps they hoped to exploit. Names that once opened doors now closed them. One officer stepped into the hallway, shaking his head. They really thought they could talk their way out, he muttered to his partner. Not tonight, the partner replied. Not with him involved. The woman Daniel had protected sat with a detective, wrapped in a borrowed jacket, hands trembling as adrenaline faded. She recounted every detail, her voice steadier with each sentence. When she finished, the detective nodded. You did the right thing, he said. And so did he. She hesitated. Who is he? The detective considered his answer. Someone with the means to make sure this doesn't happen again. Daniel reached his building just as the doorman opened the door, surprise flickering across his face before professionalism snapped back into place. Good evening, Mr. Cross. Evening, Daniel replied, handing him the bag. Dinner arrived late. Could you warm it? Of course. The elevator ride up was quiet, smooth, insulated from the city below. Daniel leaned back against the wall, eyes closed briefly. He thought of the young men's faces when realization hit. He felt no satisfaction, only resolve. Power used for humiliation was cheap. Power used for protection had weight. At home, Emma ran to him the moment the door opened, homework forgotten. You're late, she accused, hugging him anyway. I know, Daniel said, kissing the top of her head. The city needed a reminder. She looked up, confused. A reminder of what? Daniel smiled softly. That people should be kind. Later, after Emma was asleep, Daniel sat alone at the dining table, laptop open. Emails poured in, advisors, board members, friends who had recognized his name in the reports already circulating quietly. He ignored most of them. One message, however, caught his attention. From Mark Reynolds. Subject, we should talk. Daniel stared at it for a long moment, then closed the laptop without replying. Elsewhere, Mark Reynolds paced his study, anger radiating off him like heat. His nephew had called in tears, reputation already cracking. Mark had spent decades insulating his family from consequence. He had assumed that insulation was permanent. It was a misunderstanding, Mark muttered to himself. Cross overreacted. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Daniel Cross didn't overreact. He acted with precision. And when Cross acted, the fallout was never limited to the obvious target. The next morning, headlines would be restrained but unmistakable. Legal processes would unfold. Donations would quietly disappear. Invitations would be rescinded. Boards would ask uncomfortable questions. And Daniel Cross would return to his routines, to school drop-offs and late dinners, having paid the price of being seen, once again, to ensure someone else didn't pay a far greater one. The city slept uneasily, aware now that beneath its noise walked men who did not need permission to redraw the lines. And somewhere deep in its foundations, the balance continued to shift. Morning arrived with no ceremony. The city woke the way it always did. Late alarms, hurried coffee, traffic that believed it was urgent. But beneath the surface routine, something had shifted. Daniel Cross felt it before he read a single message. Power had a pressure to it like weather. And today the air was heavy. Daniel stood in his kitchen, watching Emma tie her shoes, her tongue slightly out in concentration. He leaned against the counter, arms folded, suit jacket draped over a chair. He looked like any other father preparing for a school run. The difference was what waited for him afterward. Dad, Emma said suddenly, why were those men mean last night? Daniel froze for half a breath. He hadn't told her. Children noticed more than adults like to believe. Sometimes people forget how to behave, he said carefully. And sometimes they need to be reminded. Emma nodded, satisfied. You reminded them. Daniel smiled. Yes. But the reminder wasn't just for them. At the office, the reaction was immediate. Executives stopped mid-sentence when Daniel entered the boardroom. No one asked how his evening had been. They already knew. The room was glass and steel and quiet authority, a space where billion-dollar decisions were made without raised voices. Media is circling, his communications director said. Nothing public yet, but Reynolds' camp is making calls. Daniel sat at the head of the table. Let them. Legal counsel cleared his throat. Mark Reynolds wants a private meeting. Daniel didn't look up from the report in front of him. Declined. There was a pause. He won't take that well. Daniel finally lifted his eyes. He doesn't have to. Across town, Mark Reynolds was not taking it well at all. Mark slammed his phone down on his desk, knuckles white. Decades of leverage had trained him to expect compliance. He had built a world where favors replaced accountability. And now one man, had disrupted it. He embarrassed my family, Mark snapped to his advisor. In public. The advisor hesitated. With respect, sir, your nephew did that himself. Mark shot him a glare sharp enough to cut. Cross didn't have to escalate. Daniel Cross doesn't escalate, the advisor said carefully. He concludes. The word lingered like a threat. By midday the retaliation began, not loud, not obvious, but strategic. Anonymous tips reached journalists. Regulatory bodies received complaints. Partners received calls urging caution. It was old money playbook warfare, pressure through proximity. Daniel felt each move as it happened. He didn't react emotionally. He responded structurally. Calls were returned. Documents surfaced. Countermeasures deployed. By afternoon, Reynolds' influence began to crack. A charity board quietly asked for his resignation. A bank delayed a favorable restructuring. A senator didn't return his call. Mark stared at the evidence of erosion in disbelief. "This is impossible," he whispered. No, it was inevitable. Meanwhile, the three young men sat with lawyers who no longer sounded confident. Charges were filed. Bail was denied for one of them due to prior behavior records uncovered overnight. The reality of consequence settled in, heavy and irreversible. One of them stared at the wall and whispered, "We should have just walked away." Back at Cross Holdings, Daniel's assistant approached cautiously. "Sir." "The woman. She asked to see you." Daniel nodded. "Bring her in." She entered the office slowly, nervous, hands clasped. She looked different now, steadier, safer. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "Not just for last night. For everything after." Daniel gestured for her to sit. "You didn't owe anyone gratitude," he said. "You owed yourself safety." She hesitated. "People like them, they think no one will stop them." Daniel's voice softened. "They think power is permission. They're wrong." When she left, Daniel stood at the window watching the city stretch below. He knew this moment would pass. They always did. But the pattern mattered. Each intervention rewrote expectations. That evening, Emma fell asleep on the couch, homework still open. Daniel carried her to bed, tucking her in with practiced care. As he stood to leave, she stirred. "Dad?" she murmured. "Yes." "You're not scary," she said. "You're safe." Daniel swallowed. Those were the words that mattered. Not headlines. Not influence. Later that night, Daniel finally opened Mark Reynolds' email. He read it once. Then he deleted it. Mark sat alone in his study, staring at his reflection in the dark window. For the first time in years he felt exposed. His power had been challenged not by noise but by principle. And principle was harder to fight. Across the city the woman slept without fear. The young men lay awake, confronting consequences. Boards recalculated. Alliances shifted. Quiet systems adjusted to a new equilibrium. Daniel Cross sat at his desk, reviewing tomorrow's agenda, already moving forward. Power had pushed back. And it had lost. The first sign that Mark Reynolds was losing control came quietly, the way real collapses always did. There was no announcement, no confrontation. Just absence. Invitations that stopped arriving. Calls that went unanswered. Familiar leverage that suddenly slipped through his fingers like sand. Mark sat in his private club lounge, staring at a glass of untouched whiskey. The room had once bent itself around him. Waiters hovering, members nodding with respect, conversations lowering when he passed. Today the energy was different. Polite. Distant. People smiled without warmth, spoke without commitment, and drifted away when he approached. He noticed everything. Across the city, Daniel Cross noticed nothing at all. Or rather, he noticed only what mattered. Daniel walked Emma to school that morning, holding her hand as they crossed the street. She chattered about a science project, about stars and gravity, about how some things pulled others toward them without touching. Daniel smiled at the coincidence, listening closely, filing the thought away. Children often understood power better than adults. They sensed attraction and consequence instinctively. At the office, Daniel's day unfolded with precision. A regulatory inquiry resolved itself when auditors found nothing to question. A hesitant partner reaffirmed their commitment after a quiet review of long-term projections. A media outlet decided not to run a speculative story after legal counsel gently reminded them of accuracy standards. None of it felt dramatic. That was the point. Power that needed drama was fragile. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds' nephew sat in a holding cell, staring at the floor. The bravado that had carried him through life had dissolved completely. His lawyer had stopped promising miracles and started explaining timelines. Court dates. Records. The permanence of documentation. "I didn't know who he was," the nephew said weakly. The lawyer sighed. "That's the problem. You didn't know who you were." Mark received the call in silence. When it ended, he closed his eyes and felt the weight of years pressing down on him. He had spent a lifetime teaching his family that rules were flexible if you were important enough. Now the lesson had reversed itself. At Cross Holdings, Daniel convened a brief meeting. No raised voices. No gloating. "We're not here to punish," he told his executives. "We're here to correct." One of them nodded. "Reynolds' bleeding influence." Daniel folded his hands. "Then let him bleed quietly. This ends when behavior changes, not when someone begs." That afternoon, Daniel received an unexpected visitor. Elliot Crane stood in the doorway of Daniel's office, impeccably dressed, eyes sharp with respect. "You made waves," Elliot said. Daniel gestured for him to sit. "Waves settle." Elliot smiled faintly. "Only after they reshaped the shoreline." They spoke briefly, efficiently. Elliot didn't ask why Daniel had intervened. He already knew. They spoke instead about balance, about responsibility that came with reach, about the danger of letting entitlement grow unchecked. "You scared a lot of people," Elliot said finally. Daniel shook his head. "I reminded them." Across town, the woman Daniel had protected returned to her routine. She walked the same street again, heart pounding at first, then slowing. She noticed cameras. Police presence. Awareness. She realized that safety, once modeled, could be contagious. She wasn't invisible anymore. Mark Reynolds tried one last maneuver. He arranged a dinner with mutual acquaintances, hoping proximity would soften Daniel's stance. The invitations went out. The responses trickled in. Regrets. Conflicts. Silence. The dinner never happened. That night, Mark sat alone in his study again, staring at an old photograph of himself shaking hands with powerful men. He had mistaken access for authority, influence for immunity. He had believed control meant never being challenged. Daniel Cross had shattered that illusion without ever raising his voice. At home, Daniel helped Emma with her project, gluing tiny paper planets to a rotating frame. She spun it gently, watching them orbit. "See," she said proudly. "They stay in line because of gravity." Daniel smiled. "And what happens if something pushes too hard?" Emma thought for a moment. "Things fall apart." Daniel nodded. "Exactly." Later, after Emma slept, Daniel stood on his balcony, the city spread below him in lights and movement. He knew this phase would end soon. It always did. Power resisted change until resistance became more painful than adaptation. The systems were adjusting now. Boards rewriting policies. Firms revisiting conduct clauses. Parents having uncomfortable conversations with their children about behavior and consequence. Mark Reynolds would survive. Men like him always did. But he would never again believe the world was his to command without accountability. And the young men who had laughed on that street would carry the lesson longer than any punishment could enforce. They had learned that silence could weigh more than shouting, that calm could dismantle arrogance, that some men did not need to threaten to be feared. Daniel turned back inside, locking the door behind him. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new responsibilities. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Not pride, not triumph. Alignment. The illusion of control had been exposed. And the truth had taken its place. The city adjusted the way organisms did, quietly, internally, without ceremony. Policies were revised. Security contracts expanded. Human resources departments circulated memos about conduct that had existed for years but were now being read carefully. The reckoning was not loud, and that was precisely why it worked. Daniel Cross watched the changes from a distance. He stood at the edge of a conference room, hands in his pockets, listening as executives discussed quarterly forecasts. The numbers were strong. They always were. But Daniel's attention drifted past margins and projections to the subtler metrics. The tone of conversation, the absence of arrogance, the careful choice of words. Fear had not entered the room. Awareness had. That was the difference. When the meeting ended, his legal counsel stayed behind. Reynolds' legal team reached out again, she said. "They want mediation." Daniel shook his head. "There's nothing to mediate. They're worried about long-term exposure." Daniel met her eyes. "Then they should be." Across town, Mark Reynolds sat in a downtown law office, surrounded by people who charged by the hour and spoke in measured tones. Charts lay spread across the table: losses, liabilities, reputational risk. Each line represented something Mark had once controlled. "We can still contain this," one attorney said carefully. "But you'll need to step back. Publicly." Mark stared at the table. "Step back." "Yes. Temporarily. It sends a signal." Mark laughed bitterly. "A signal to who?" Him. To everyone, the attorney replied. Mark leaned back, suddenly exhausted. For the first time he understood the cruelty of quiet power. There was no opponent to fight, no scandal to spin, no leverage to pull. Daniel Cross had removed himself from the board entirely and let the system do what it was designed to do, correct imbalance. In a holding cell across the city, the tallest of the three young men sat alone, hands clasped, staring at the wall. His court-appointed attorney had finished explaining the charges and left him with pamphlets and reality. The young man replayed the moment over and over, the calm voice, the steady eyes, the way confidence drained out of the street like air from a punctured tire. He whispered to himself. He didn't even yell. That thought haunted him more than the charges. The woman Daniel had protected attended a community meeting that week. She spoke hesitantly at first, then with growing strength. She talked about fear, about silence, about how quickly things changed when one person refused to look away. People listened. Some nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. But all of them heard her. Afterward, a young woman approached her. I thought I was alone, she said softly. You're not, she replied. I meant it. Daniel received a letter, not an email, not a call. A letter. It was from a foundation that had once denied funding to a women's safety initiative, citing insufficient impact metrics. The letter asked if Cross Foundation would consider partnering on a pilot program. Daniel read it once and passed it to his assistant. Proceed, he said. Quietly. At home, life continued in its small, irreplaceable ways. Emma practiced piano, missing notes and laughing at herself. Daniel cooked dinner, burned the first attempt, and ordered takeout instead. They ate on the couch, watching a documentary about planets and gravity. Emma paused the screen. Dad. Yes. Why do some people think they can do whatever they want? Daniel considered the question. Because sometimes they get away with it, he said. Until they don't. She nodded, satisfied, and pressed play. Late that night, Daniel stood in his study, reviewing messages he had ignored for days. One stood out, short, direct. From Mark Reynolds, subject. I understand now. Daniel stared at it for a long time. He didn't respond. Understanding, Daniel knew, was not a request. It was a conclusion. The next morning, Mark Reynolds submitted his resignation from 2 boards. The press release was bland, corporate, bloodless. But the message traveled fast. The illusion was officially broken. At Cross Holdings, Daniel's team noticed the shift immediately. Deals moved faster. Conversations sharpened. People listened more than they spoke. Respect replaced assumption. One executive said quietly, "You changed the temperature of the room." Daniel replied, "No. I removed the heater." That afternoon, Daniel walked the same street where it had all begun. The boutique windows reflected the sky. People passed without fear, without spectacle. A police cruiser idled nearby, not aggressively, just present. Daniel paused for a moment, then continued on. Power, he reflected, was not about domination. It was about boundaries. About deciding what was acceptable and enforcing it without cruelty. It was about using reach to lift, not to crush. Behind him, the city breathed easier. Ahead of him, the future waited, less noisy, more deliberate, and finally aligned with the values Daniel had spent a lifetime protecting. The reckoning had come and gone. No applause. No victory lap. Just balance restored. The city moved on. That was how Daniel Cross knew it was over. No lingering headlines. No whispered speculation trailing him through rooms. No sudden hush when he entered a space. The city returned to its habits, its distractions, its endless forward motion. For most people, the incident had already become a footnote. Something that happened, mattered briefly, and then gave way to the next urgency. That was the outcome Daniel had intended. On a crisp morning weeks later, Daniel walked Emma to school again. The trees lining the street had begun to change, their leaves turning gold and rust, clinging stubbornly before letting go. Emma skipped ahead, backpack bouncing, unburdened by the weight her father carried so carefully. "Dad," she said, stopping suddenly, "do you think people can change?" Daniel considered the question longer than she expected. Cars passed. A bus hissed at the curb. "Yes," he said finally. "But only after they see themselves clearly." Emma smiled and ran ahead, the answer enough. Daniel watched her disappear through the school doors before turning back toward the street. He did not linger. Protection was not about hovering. It was about building a world sturdy enough to stand when you stepped away. At Cross Holdings, the atmosphere had settled into something new. The tension that once accompanied power had softened into responsibility. Meetings were shorter. Decisions clearer. People spoke with intention instead of performance. The systems Daniel had trusted were doing what they were meant to do, sustaining fairness without supervision. His assistant handed him a final report related to the incident. Charges resolved. Programs funded. Policy changes enacted. The ripple had completed its arc. Archive it, Daniel said. Yes, sir. Across the city, Mark Reynolds packed up his office. The room felt unfamiliar now, stripped of authority. He paused at the doorway, looking back at the desk where he had once dictated terms. He had lost more than influence. He had lost the illusion that influence was permanent. As he turned off the lights, he felt something unexpected, not bitterness but clarity. The world had not betrayed him. It had corrected him. In a small apartment not far away, the woman Daniel had protected prepared dinner, humming softly. She moved through her space with ease now, windows open, shoulders relaxed. The fear that once tightened her steps had loosened its grip. She checked her phone. A message from the community group she now volunteered with. Another woman safe, another ride home, another voice heard. She smiled. In a different part of the city, the young men faced consequences that would follow them for years. Records, restrictions, hard conversations they could no longer avoid. One of them sat alone in his room, staring at the wall, replaying the moment again and again. Not the sirens. Not the arrest. But the calm. He finally understood what had unsettled him so deeply. Daniel Cross hadn't needed to dominate him. He had simply stood firm, unmoved, impossible to intimidate. The young man realized then that true power did not need permission, and that terrified him more than force ever could. Weeks later, Daniel stood on his balcony at dusk, the city glowing below. He held a cup of tea instead of a phone, listening to the distant sounds of life continuing as it always had. Somewhere laughter echoed. Somewhere else an argument flared and faded. The city was imperfect. It always would be. But it was learning. Daniel thought back to the street where it had all begun. The noise, the laughter, the cruelty disguised as confidence. He had not gone there intending to change anything. He had simply refused to accept what was happening in front of him. That refusal had been enough. Emma stepped onto the balcony, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "It's cold," she said. Daniel draped his arm around her. "Change always is at first." She leaned into him, looking out at the lights. "I like it when things are quiet," she said. Daniel smiled, a rare, unguarded expression. "So do I." Silence, he had learned, was not the absence of action. It was the result of it done right. A world where shouting was unnecessary because boundaries were understood. Where power protected instead of threatened. Where people could walk freely without calculating danger at every corner. The city below continued breathing, imperfect, resilient, alive. Daniel Cross stood there not as a hero, not as a symbol, not even as a billionaire. Just as a man who had stepped forward once, calmly, decisively, and then stepped back. And that was enough. If you believe real power doesn't shout, if you believe justice can be calm, and if you believe some stories are meant to remind the world how authority truly works, subscribe. This channel tells stories where arrogance collapses, silence speaks louder than threats, and underestimated people change everything. New stories every week. No noise. No hype. Just power, consequence, and truth. Subscribe now because not everyone sees it coming.